Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a list you guys sent us. A list of the top 10 most infamous serial killers.
From the top10s.com.
Yeah, the top10s.com. And it's interesting because, you know, it's not just the names. You want to know, like, why these figures kind of capture our imaginations.
Right.
What makes them infamous?
And what we can learn.
What can we learn from these stories? And it's cool because, you know, the list itself is user-generated.
Right.
So it's got all these so it's not just like the cold facts. You get to see how people perceive these figures.
Yeah, it's really interesting how people perceive them. And, you know, it's not even just about body count necessarily. It's about the, you know, narratives we build around them. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to crack the code of infamy itself. So let's start with the ones everybody knows.
Right.
You know, Jack the Ripper.
Of course.
Ted Bundy.
Yep.
Zodiac Killer. Like the holy trinity of serial killer notoriety.
Right.
Why are they always at the top of the list?
Well, I think it's because they each represent a different kind of hook that draws us in. Like, for example, Jack the Ripper, he embodies the unsolved mystery. Like, he vanished into the fog, and he left behind all these unanswered questions that still haunt us today.
And, I mean, people in the comments really say that. One person wrote, his name dwarfs anyone else on this list. And another one said, oftentimes, a serial killer's main goal is fame, so I guess Jack wins.
Like, that's kind of unsettling, right? To think that notoriety itself could be, like, a motive.
Yeah, that is. It's almost like they want to have a legacy of some sort, even if it's really messed up. But then you have, like, Ted Bundy. He used charisma. You know, he looked normal on the outside, and he used that as a weapon, so it was even scarier.
Right.
Because you wouldn't expect it. It's that whole don't judge a book by its cover. Yeah. And the comments about him are wild. Some focus on his looks, like people say he looked handsome and normal, but underneath that smile was a monster.
Yeah.
And then others focus on like his methods, like how he escaped from custody, or just like the sheer audacity of his crimes. Is it that contradiction, like that kind of like charming psychopath thing that makes him so fascinating, do you think?
Yeah, I think it definitely plays a role. It's just that fear that you can't always judge a book by its cover, and evil can really be hiding anywhere. Then there's the Zodiac Killer, and he's a master manipulator too, but in a different way. He taunted everybody like the public, the police. He was sending ciphers and these weird messages, so he turned the whole thing into a big public spectacle.
And people are still obsessed with that unsolved puzzle, decades later. Like Jack the Ripper will probably never know his true identity, or another one simply says, I want to know who that bastard is. Like, we need that closure, you know? Like to put a face to the evil so we can like have a sense of control over something so chaotic.
It's a natural human thing to want to seek order and understand things even when they're really messed up. But here's where the list gets really interesting. When you look past these top 3 guys, it's obvious that infamy isn't only about like how many people they killed or if it's a mystery or not.
It's about like the nature of the crimes, right?
Exactly.
Their personality and how they impact our culture.
It's more than just numbers. Like you could have a killer with tons of victims nobody remembers. And then someone like Ed Gein with not that many, but he becomes this icon of horror.
Why is that?
Well, Gein is an interesting case. His crimes, like robbing graves and then making like trophies out of body parts, it just tapped into something primal.
Oh, yeah.
Like violating the boundaries of life and death. And it resonated with horror movies like Norman Bates, Leatherface. They were inspired by him.
So he wasn't just a killer. He was like a symbol.
Totally.
I mean, one comment even said, he turned parts of the bodies of deceased women into furniture. That's an image that just like stays with you.
It's visceral.
Yeah.
And it just violates our sense of decency. And that's what makes him so memorable, I think. But it also makes you wonder, like, is it the act itself that makes a killer infamous? Or is it the impact their crimes have on our imaginations?
But we see that with other people on the list.
Yeah.
Like John Wayne Gacy. It wasn't just the number of victims. It was the fact that he was a creepy clown.
Yeah.
Like this guy who was entertaining children.
Yeah, one comment said, he worked as a birthday party entertainer while doing so. So you have the clown, a symbol of innocence, and then you have these horrific crimes. It's just really messed up.
It's a good reminder that it's more than just facts and figures. Like how we see these guys is shaped by so much more, like our own fears and our cultural understanding.
Yeah, for sure.
All of it.
And sometimes the public is totally divided on a killer too, like with Aileen Wuornos.
Oh, yeah.
She claims she killed those 7 men in self-defense because she was working as a prostitute.
Right.
And it caused a huge debate about her guilt and whether she was a victim herself.
And the comments are all over the place.
Oh, yeah.
Some people believe her. Some people think she was cold-blooded. So her case makes you think, like, how do we judge the motives of someone who does such horrible things? And how much does public opinion influence how we ultimately view them?
It's a tough question. It really shows how powerful a story is. We love stories, and we try to make sense of things, even really awful things. So we try to fit them into a narrative we understand, like revenge or a cry for help or just pure evil. And those stories end up contributing to how infamous they become.
So we're always looking for an explanation, some way to understand, even when it seems impossible. Which brings us to another fascinating thing about this list, how we try to rank evil. We try to decide who's the worst of the worst.
Right, right. It's not always about the numbers, though, is it?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the type of crimes that make people really freak out. Like Albert Fish, one person wrote, although he doesn't have the highest quantity of murders, what he did to his victims should indisputably land him in the top 3. Like, it's the brutality that makes him stand out.
It's like we're trying to figure out the boundaries of evil. Like, what makes a regular murderer different from someone who is just beyond comprehension? And some guys, like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, seem to use that. Like, they play on our fears with satanic stuff and rituals.
Yeah. Like, a Ramirez is a perfect example of how a killer can use symbols to be more notorious. The list says he left satanic pentagrams at some of the crime scenes. So that detail just adds to the mystery and the dread. It brings up those fears about the occult and evil we don't understand.
And that fear, that sense of the unknown, it's powerful. We'll be back in a moment to continue our exploration of the top 10 most infamous serial killers. And you know what makes them stick around in our minds for so long?
They become like cultural shorthand. Like you say, Jack the Ripper, and everybody pictures that foggy London street.
Yeah, for sure.
And the guy in the shadows.
And speaking of how we see them culturally, one thing that stands out is there aren't that many women on this list.
Right.
You've got Belle Gunness. She's thought to have killed like over 40 people for insurance money. And then you have Mary Ann Cotton. She poisoned a bunch of husbands and children.
Yeah.
And it seems like she was doing it for money too. So it makes you think, like, are their motives just less infamous to people?
That's a good question. Like, do we see women killers as more practical? Like, they're driven by things we almost get like greed or self-preservation.
Right.
But the guys are seen as driven by darker stuff.
Yeah, and maybe it's a societal thing too. Like, we have these ideas of what evil is, and it's mostly been men historically.
Right.
So maybe it's harder for a woman to fit that and to get that same level of notoriety.
Yeah, like the classic monster under the bed image.
Right.
It's almost always a man.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not that they're less evil, it's that they just don't fit how we picture evil.
Right, right. It's like we can't picture a woman who's supposed to be nurturing and caring also doing something like that. It messes with our ideas of those roles.
Totally. And that brings us back to this idea of like a hierarchy of evil. It's not just male versus female. We want to know like what makes one killer worse than another. Is it the number of victims? Or is it like how bad the crimes were? Or is there something else? Something we can't really put our finger on.
This list definitely tries to answer that. You've got Pedro Lopez. He killed over 100 young girls.
Wow.
Got declared insane. And then was released.
Wow.
And there's a comment that says, the worst part is he escaped to God knows where. Like, he could be anywhere. That adds to the whole thing.
It's like the ultimate loose end, like pure fear that evil can't be stopped. And it makes you think about how random violence is. Like, it could happen to anybody, anywhere.
And then there's Luis Garavito. He's listed as having the most kills. But does that automatically make him the most infamous? Or is it that he tortured and killed young boys? Like, that makes him stand out even more?
I think it's both. The number is definitely shocking. But it's also like he violated these innocent kids, the most vulnerable people. That makes it even worse.
Yeah, like, at some point, the number doesn't matter as much. It's not just about how many people. It's the emotional impact. Like how these crimes mess with our feeling of safety.
Exactly. And then some killers, like Harold Shipman, used that trust. He was a doctor who killed at least 215 patients. He used his position to hurt people. Someone wrote he's possibly the most prolific and intelligent serial killer in history. He derived pleasure from killing. That's just chilling. Like, he liked it.
Yeah, it goes way past like a crime of passion or messed up morals.
Yeah.
It's like he wasn't even human. Like, he didn't have any empathy.
Right. It's that lack of connection that makes them so fascinating and scary. They're like the ultimate other, like our worst fears about what people are capable of.
It's like looking in a mirror and seeing this twisted reflection of ourselves. And it's scary, but we can't look away.
And that brings us to why we're so drawn to this stuff. Is it just curiosity? Or do we need to understand the extremes of what people do? Or is it something more, like facing our own mortality, our own potential for darkness?
I think it's probably all of those things. We're interested in things we don't understand. things that scare us. But maybe it's also a way to protect ourselves. Like if we study these cases, we might learn something about the warning signs, about how close we all are to chaos.
Maybe if we look at the worst of humanity, we can understand what makes us who we are, what choices we make, and what those choices lead to.
Yeah. One comment said, we're all capable of darkness, but it's the choices we make that define who we are. It's a pretty powerful idea.
It is, like, even with all this horror, we still have the choice to be compassionate, to be understanding.
And maybe by studying these cases, we can help make a world where people always choose the good over the bad.
Definitely. One last thing for you guys to think about. Someone in the comments pointed out that Elizabeth Bathory isn't usually on these top 10 lists. She was a Hungarian countess who tortured and murdered tons of young women. They wrote, she killed more people than anyone else on this list, and her victims suffered the most.
It is weird that she's not on there more. It makes you wonder, like, are there other things going on that decide who we remember and who we forget? Whose stories get told and whose don't?
It's a good question, because the stories we tell about ourselves and our history, about good and evil, those stories make us who we are.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to make a map of evil, but the map keeps changing. And this list with the rankings and the comments, it just shows you how we all see it differently.
Right. What makes a killer infamous depends on so many things, like when it happened, how much the media covered it, the culture at the time.
Someone who was a big deal 100 years ago might be totally forgotten now.
Exactly.
And someone else might be famous for totally random reasons, not even because of their crimes. And the comments show that. Like, people are trying to figure out why some killers stick with us and others don't.
Yeah, it's like we're all trying to write the story of evil together so we can understand that dark side of humanity. But the story's always being rewritten, like as we learn new things and our values change.
Which brings us back to you guys and why you sent us this list. You wanted to know who these people are, but also why we're so fascinated by them, why they're still in our heads.
And I think the big takeaway is that it's not just about being morbidly curious. It's about understanding ourselves, about figuring out the limits of what people can do, about facing the darkness that's in all of us.
It's like looking in a funhouse mirror. You see humanity, but it's all twisted and messed up. But you can't look away.
Maybe it's because by looking into that darkness, we learn something about ourselves, about the choices we make, the paths we don't take, the things that hold us together.
One comment said, we're all capable of darkness, but it's the choices we make that define who we are. That's a really important point, I think.
Yeah, it reminds us that even with all the bad stuff out there, we can still choose to be good, to have empathy, to try to understand each other.
And maybe by studying these cases and figuring out what leads to violence, we can create a world where people always choose good over evil.
Here's one last thing for you guys to think about. One comment pointed out that Elizabeth Bathory isn't usually on these top 10 lists. She was this Hungarian countess. She tortured and killed hundreds of young women. They wrote, she killed more people than anyone else on this list, and her victims suffered the most.
Yeah, it's weird that she's not mentioned more. Makes you wonder if there are other reasons why we remember some people and not others. Whose stories we tell and whose we don't.
It's a question worth thinking about, because the stories we choose to tell, they really do shape who we are.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of serial killers. We hope you found it interesting and thought-provoking, and maybe a little creepy. Remember, there's always more to learn, more to explore. So keep being curious and keep diving deep.